I want to talk about what it's like to grow up in a family that has addiction. So I grew up in a family that was addicted to alcohol, and so I grew up with both parents addicted to alcohol, and I had two siblings. I had an older brother and an older sister, and I kind of came into the family unexpectedly. I was born 11 months after my sister, and she had an older brother. So I came in at a time in that family where things were not really stable. So my mother and father uh, were partiers. They liked to drink, and my father was actually 14 years younger than my mother, and there was a lot of joking around at the time when they were dating prior to having children that was a relationship that wouldn't have lasted. And then sort of to kind of combat the bets, the two of them decided to marry. Probably not the best idea. And they had two children, a boy and a girl. And and my father wasn't really ready to be married and to take on a family. He was rather young at the time, and he wasn't ready to settle down. And he had a lot of other ideas, I think, other than being ready to be the father of a family. And so there had already been problems before I came onto the scene. And so 11 months after my sister, obviously I wasn't planned. My sister wasn't a well child either. She had a lot of medical issues. She was an Rh negative baby. She was colicky. So she was a pretty big handful medically for my mother. She was also the apple of my father's eye. He wanted a daughter, so he did dote on her to some degree. So she was there was a kind of a bond between them, as much as there could be, with my father kind of coming and going and getting in trouble with drinking. And he would fight, he would drink, he would steal things from the places that he would go, drinking bars. You know, he'd steal sometimes the musical instruments that the people were playing at the bar, things like that. Get himself in trouble, get arrested for drinking and disorderly, whatever, and not really contribute financially to the family. Often he would try and steal money from my mother, who was trying to use the money to obviously take care of the children. So I come into that family. Obviously, I wasn't really planned for, and it added an extra burden onto my mother at the time that made it difficult for her, given that she already had two other children and one of them wasn't well medically. And so my father was coming and going, and often not being there, not being helpful when he was. And so that was the start of not a very stable family. And so by the time I was about 5, I think my father, there was a number of reasons for him leaving. One, that he was having an affair with the woman that lived upstairs that sometimes babysat us. And two, he was on trial at the time for robbery at a jewelry store, in which he was probably going to end up doing time for. And so he decided to take off with the woman that lived upstairs and make a run for it before he would end up being jailed for that. And the jewelry, it was interesting. Later in the story, my mother told us, they came looking for the jewelry, the police, and they turned everything upside down trying to find it. And she'd been peeling potatoes from a 50-pound bag of potatoes at the time, making a supper. And after they left, she went back to peeling the potatoes, and she found the jewelry in the bottom of the bag and called the police back and told them, take the jewelry. She'd had enough of him. She wanted him gone by that point. He was more of a burden than he was of a help. He would be, like I said, stealing the money she needed to take care of us. So I think she pretty much had enough of him by that point, and she was glad that he was going to be gone and out of our lives. My sister, on the other hand, was beside herself when he didn't come back. So at 6, she lost the father that had sort of given her a sense that she was really special to him, and so she was, I would say, she was a grieving child at 6, and I say that because I remember looking at photographs of the family. And my sister was always crying in those pictures. And it was only later in my life that I really took note of that and realized that my sister was probably bereaved of the loss of her dad. And nobody really recognize that, and no one can really recognize much in a family where alcohol is rampant. You just People don't, when people are drinking regularly, they just don't recognize what's going on in their home. They just don't. They're caught up in their drinking. They can't actually see what's happening in the house. They can't look at their children and really understand how their children are hurt or damaged. And so, of course, nobody really understood what was going on with my sister. And she was often thought of as a child with like bad nerves. Everybody talked about bad nerves back then. There was little understanding of mental health issues, anything like that when I was growing up. So nobody really understood what my sister's problem really was, other than they sort of realized that she there was something about my dad, but I don't think they really understood what it was, or anybody really thought about it very much. She just was going to be the problem child. That was about it. And she was like very ill as a very young child, and there were umpteen other problems that would medically show up over the years related to being an Rh negative baby. She would have problems with her teeth, and she would have to have braces. She would have to have surgeries. So there were other problems that would plague her through her childhood. So my mother was not a happy person after my father left, and she told us many really stories about my father, that some were funny and interesting. Others we didn't need to hear. There were things that you perhaps shouldn't have said to us. And again, when people are drinking a lot, they don't think about what they're saying. Often what you'll see in these addicted families is they cross generations and tell children things that children shouldn't hear, inappropriate things that shouldn't be said to kids. So one of the things my mother would frequently say, it was, all men are bastards and they only want one thing, which is sex, obviously. And so that's problematic. It's problematic to tell your daughters that, because that's not a good thing for little girls to grow up thinking, and definitely not a good thing if you have a son. So you shouldn't be making statements like that, because what did your son think of that? Hopefully it's not going to damage his sense of self. All men are bastards and they only want one thing. That's not really a good thing to tell your son. But anyways, that was something my mother often said. And she told many stories about his escapades and things that he did. One was that he shot off the end of his finger once while he was put in a sheriff's office because he drank too much in a small town. And he shot off the end of his finger, and he called her saying he was going to bleed to death. And she laughed and said, "Bleed to death," and slammed the phone down, and had no intentions of helping him out with that, because that was typical of him, getting into trouble while he was drinking. But, these were all these, funny stories that we heard about my father, his escapades while drinking. So we heard a lot of those kinds of stories as we grew up. That was the only sort of presence of my father. I don't have a lot of memories of my father. He doesn't have a real physical presence in my life. One of the memories I do have as a child is, and I was very young, I was about 3. It's very vivid. It's like a film that I can remember. And my brother and sister ran outside. It was a snowy day, and they ran out to play in the snow. And I wasn't old enough to sort of get the snowsuit sort of set up, and I was trying to get the zipper going, and I couldn't figure it out. So I knew my father was in a bedroom. I think it was my brother's bedroom at the time. And so I went to open the door to ask him if he could help me with the zipper. And when I opened the door, he was in bed with this woman that lived upstairs, who sometimes babysat us. And he kicked the door very suddenly, and the doorknob hit me in the head and knocked me back and out. And there was a concussion that I know I did have as a child, and I'm pretty sure that was what caused the concussion. And so it's very vivid in my mind, that scene. I didn't know what they were doing. I was too young, obviously, to understand what was happening. It was only much later in my life that when I understood, what sex was and what people do, that I was able to sort of, in retrospect, figure out what they had been doing that day, because I wouldn't have known. I was way too young to understand what was happening. So that's one of the memories I have of him. The second memory, and there was only two that I can really recall, is when he left. So I remember I was sitting outside. I was such an insecure child because I wasn't wanted, and the messages I got around not being a wanted child, I was never able to be secure enough to really make friends or feel um, um, confident enough to actually be around other people, other peers, and feel okay about myself. And remember I was sitting on the front step crying because, the kids were all playing, and I couldn't fit in and play with them. And he asked me what I was crying about. And I just said, because the kids wouldn't let me play with them. And he said something like, well, I'm going to bring you back a gift. He was going somewhere. And I remember my sister running over to see him because she was really attached to him. And he said something to her. And then the two of us sort of watched him, and he walked down the street. And literally was the last time I ever saw him. I really recall him walking down that street. And why it's so burned in my mind, him walking down that street. And I think it's because we never saw him again. And that's why that image is so powerful, was that I saw him walking down the street, and I would never see him again. He would never come walking down that street again. And it's painful because I was 5, and we would never see him again, That would be it. And we would never know that he wasn't coming back. And so that was it. And that was the strange thing about the family, right? So my mother would never tell us that my father wasn't coming back, because so much is not discussed in an alcoholic home. And she was angry. And so she never said anything. And she was so angry, my mother, and a small woman, but her anger was very large. And so you learn quickly, certainly I learned quickly, not to ask certain things. And so I never asked her, where's my dad? And because I was afraid, she was so angry at him. And for good reason. I mean, she had a lot of reasons to be angry at my father, because he just did not fulfill the role of father. He wouldn't go to work. My mother was very diligent about going to work, and always did. She always went to work. She never missed a day, and paying bills. She was really good at that. And my father was drinking and not coming home, and of course he would run out of money. He would steal my mother's money, and that was the money to take care of her kids. And she couldn't have that. Like that was a problem. She needed money to take care of her children, and he didn't care. And he would steal anything. She said he could smell money. She couldn't hide it in enough places where he wouldn't find it and spend it. And that was very difficult for her. She would hide it in places she'd think he couldn't possibly find it, but he would find it. And it says something about the degree in which that was burnt into her mind, because even years later, long after he was gone and would never return, she was still hiding money. And even after her death, I remember finding money under the linoleum tile in her bedroom, as if that practice never went away. So it says something about how much that impacted her, that act of him stealing the money from her. And then that was his alcoholism, because that's all he was interested in, was drinking at the time. And he left too, and it would be important to say he was involved in a lot of illegal acts, and he would steal a lot. He not only stole from my mother, but he stole from other places, and he stole things. He was involved in criminal activities. And what he did was he robbed a jewelry store, and of course he would have gone to prison for that. He was on trial for that particular crime, and it, the police had come to check the house, and they didn't find the jewelry. But my mother, who was peeling potatoes at the time out of a 50-pound bag of potatoes, had gone back to peeling them after they had totaled the house looking for the jewelry, and reached into the potato bag and did in fact find the jewelry. And she called them back and said, here's the jewelry, because she wanted him gone by that point. He was a detriment to us. He was making life more difficult than it needed to be, and he needed to go. And so she did that. And of course, he did leave with the woman that lived upstairs, the babysitter. And off he went, of course, to make sure he didn't get arrested and go to jail. And he stayed away. Like he went up north, and he hid up north in order not to deal with that crime. And he never served time for that crime, because he stayed away for a long time in order to avoid it. That's why he disappeared that day and didn't come back. And that left us in a very difficult situation, because, of course, it left my sister with a lot of grief, because she loved him, and she would never see him again, not as a child anyway. And it left my mother bitter, very bitter and angry, and it left her angry at me. She looked at me and the unwanted child, the child that came at a time when she didn't need another child, unplanned, unnecessary. And she was very angry at me, angry that she had to deal with this other child. And I became like, I think, a target for a while of her anger. And she began to say things to me that indicated that. And as a child, you're too young to understand any of that. And a lot of it was when she was drinking. And that's the problem with addicted parents. They're going to say things when they're intoxicated that they don't take back. And even if they try to take it back, it's too late. Once certain things are said to you, they can't be removed. The harm is done. And so she began to say, I never wanted you. I never needed you. I don't know why I ever had you. And I needed you as much as I needed two heads. And she would say that frequently. And it's very, very hurtful for a kid. You feel so uncertain of yourself, and your mother's telling you she didn't want you. And it's very, you're trying to understand why. What did I do? What did I do wrong? What's wrong? What happened? And my father's gone. So I'm thinking, oh God, was that because of me? Like, did I do something that was so terrible that my father left? And a child's mind will try to make up all sorts of reasons why this is happening. You try to figure it out, because you're trying to understand in your mind what happened. You're trying to understand what you did to make your mother not love you. And you figure there has to be a reason. So you try to figure it out. You can't ask because you're too afraid to find out, that if your mom's going to say something really terrible. So you try to figure it out yourself. And it's never a good thing to do, because, man, you're going to come up with some pretty horrible ideas. And so I figure I single-handedly destroyed my family, and I really didn't have a right to be there. And so I tried to do what anybody would try to do. I tried to rectify the situation. What could I do to fix the situation that I caused, this terrible thing? And somehow I had to figure out how to do something. And so I thought, if I just stayed out of the way, and I just didn't ask for anything, and I just tried to not be a burden, that maybe that was the best I could do, for a while. That's what I was doing. I just stayed out of the way. And then at some point I thought, well, if I just did stuff that I could help out in some way and make things easier for my mother, maybe that would be some way that I could make up for what I'd done wrong. And so I tried to do stuff that would help her. I tried to, do the dishes or clean up, or try and, make things easier for her, and try and look out for her, and try to do whatever I could, and not ask for anything. And, and so that's what I did. And you're trying to figure it out as you go along. And and that was, and that was the beginning of the end of my childhood, because I lost my childhood in the process of doing that. I lost my existence in the process of doing that, because my mother, she saw the advantage of that, and suddenly I became the person that would do all these things for her, and I lost my presence as a child. They began to fail to see me as a child, and began to see me as a co-parent of my siblings. And they had a child, and I lost mine. And it was a really hard existence for me in that family, because I wanted to be a kid. I was a kid, but I couldn't be one. And I had so little self-confidence. I had so little sense of self. When I went to school, I couldn't make friends. I wasn't okay with myself, because my mother didn't want me. How could anyone want to be with me? What did I have to offer? And so I became a neglected child too, because I stopped asking for anything. So therefore I never got anything. And then I never got the things I actually needed. And that put me in a really bad position at school, because a neglected child doesn't get clothing, doesn't get taken care of. And so, you're not looked at very nicely at school if you're not dressed appropriately, if you're not clean, if you smell bad. It's all those things that just made everything worse and worse and worse. And it turned out to be really horrible, a horrible existence for me. So I was bullied at school. I had no friends. I had a really bad existence, and it was dreadful. It was dreadful for me. And then I had this terrible place in my home, and then the fighting and the alcoholism that surrounded my family. And my mother's siblings were alcoholics, and the drinking that went on, and the fighting that went on within the family, and then the fighting with my sister and my mother that went on. And my mother would drag me out of bed at all hours of the night to go searching for my sister, and she would rant and rave and rage and rage and rage, and I would be stuck with her. And of course, my sister would sneak home from one of these places and go to sleep, and it wouldn't matter. We would go all hours of the night until my mother's rage subsided, and then we'd go home, and my sister had gone home and gone to bed, and it wouldn't matter. Just the stuff would just keep going on, and there was no acceptance of myself as a person or as a human being in any of this. And it was like a hell. I was like caught in a hell I couldn't get out of. I was there all the time. They were able to go out with their friends and have a life, and I was stuck in hell that I couldn't escape. My mother dragging me to like fights that were going on between my aunt and her boyfriend, or just anywhere, to funeral after funeral of some veterans from the Royal Legion, one dead body after another, and had to go up to the caskets of all these dead people, and I didn't want to go. And it was like I wasn't given any choices, no choices whatsoever. I just had to go with her. I was like her bodyguard, and it didn't matter. And it was like no life, and cursed and sworn at and yelled at and raged at, and made her drinking partner at 15, and like drink, have a drink with your mother, have gone to my uncle's like how many times so she could sit and drink with him. And all I wanted to do was go home to bed, and not given an option. Like, stop falling asleep, you're visiting. When I was a kid, I just wanted to go home and go to bed. I had to go to school the next day. Why do I have to sit here with you guys drinking? Why do I have to do any of these things? Why am I stuck in this situation? Like, why am I suddenly this person that can't have a child's life anymore? And why do I have to be always in the presence of all these fights and these yelling and screaming? And it just never stopped and never stopped. And like neighbors asking me, what was the fight last night? Like, just leave me alone. I don't want to be having to report on this, and like sent to school at 5 to tell I had to tell them that my father was dead, even though he wasn't. And I'm at a Catholic school, and you're not supposed to lie. If I don't lie, I'm in trouble with my mother because she doesn't want to be embarrassed by my father's a criminal. And, like it was all these places that you found yourself in. I run to get help because I think my mother's dead. She's passed out on the floor. And then I get my uncle there, and then she's yelling at me because how dare you bring somebody here? Because I was, embarrassed me. Well, I thought you were dead. Like, God almighty, for heaven's sakes, give me a break. I thought you were dead. Like, I'm 11 years old. What do you expect me to do? There's no 911. I'm not allowed to tell anybody what's going on. I went to get my uncle. I thought you were dead. Like, she's screaming at me that, like, for God's sake, I thought you were dead. Like, it was just endless stuff like this. It was like trying to stop the fights, playing peacemaker, trying to explain to each person why the other one's angry. Could they not come together? And like, there was no life there. There was just endless fighting and yelling, and like, you try to sneak out of the room before it would start, and she'd see you and come back in here and sit down. You can't leave. Like, I don't want to be here. I don't want to be here. I don't want to listen to the fight. I don't want to have to take sides. I don't want to even be involved in it. Like, why do I have to be here? And you didn't get a choice, and then, you had to go and do all the errands, and it didn't matter. Like, everything that was on sale, 20 blocks this way, 15 blocks this way, 25 blocks that way, to get all the different things that were on sale. Carrying things I couldn't carry as a kid, but it didn't matter. You had to carry them anyway. I didn't get to be a kid. My brother and sister had lives. I did not have any. And if I, by sheer chance, found a friend, I couldn't go out because then I was a son of a bitch. I was a bastard. I was just like my brother and sister. I didn't care about her. I just was going to leave her alone. How could I do that? So I'd have to call and say, I can't go because I have to be with my mother. Being dumped at my grandmother's, my father's mother's place when I was 5 in a hope that my father would come and get me because she didn't want me. Like, all that stuff, like, how do you deal with it? Like, there's no one to talk to, can't tell anyone. You just feel like, what the hell? Who am I? What am I? What am I worth? You have no worth. You have no life. You have no meaning. And I loved my mother. I loved her dearly. But you're a mess. You can't make no sense of anything. You have no place in the world. You have no meaning in the world. All these things that's been said to you, you go to school, you're bullied, you put down, you come home and say, someone's threatening to kill me. Don't tell me. I don't want to hear it. You got a problem? Deal with it yourself. There's nowhere to turn. There's nothing. You're just stuck in this maze of miserableness, of which there's no door, of which you can open, where you can get help. No one cares. You're stuck there. 365 days, every hour in the day, year after year. There's no way. I'm 13 and all I wanted to do was die. I just wanted to die. There was nothing. My life was so horrible at 13. I just wanted to die. There was nothing there for me. It's just like every day was painful. My mother would call at 8 o'clock in the morning. I had to run down, answer the telephone. That was the alarm. Then get my brother and sister up. And they were miserable as hell. They didn't want me to wake them up, but I had no choice because if I didn't get them up to go to school, I was in trouble. And then they were miserable to me. It was like no one. Could anyone just be kind for 5 seconds? Could somebody just be kind for 5 seconds? Could somebody just be decent? Like, could anybody for a second just be decent? But no, they couldn't, And it was life that And then at 15, my mother wants me drinking with her. Well, when I drank, guess what? There was some relief, because that was the only relief there could be, because there was no relief anywhere else. And then my mother gets cancer, and I'm 16, and my mother has cancer. And it's like, oh, she said when I was 5, she said she was going to die when I'm 19. She's telling the relatives that every year, dragging me in. Oh yeah, when she turns 19, I'm going to die. So there I am, 16, she's got cancer. I thought, oh yeah, she's not dying right now. She's dying when I'm 19. That's what she's going to do. She's going to die when I'm 19. Here we go. Here we go. Here goes the prediction. And you know what? She dies a day and a month before I turn 19. And I went through the cancer thing with her. It was hell. It was hell. It was hell. We couldn't get any unemployment because she had a fatal illness. She couldn't get her insurance. It was crazy, man. We had no money. We were in poverty. We lived in poverty. One of my jobs in that house was to paint the pattern back into the rug. Let's be real here, man. She worked as a lab technician in a dairy for 25 years, got paid crap because she was a woman. My mother went to work every single day. I'll tell you, she wasn't a woman that just sat around and expected people to give her money. She worked every flipping day. She was a lab technician, man. For her time, that was unbelievable. She worked hard, I loved my mother. She worked hard. She didn't, and she couldn't get any unemployment, Finally, she gets an MP to get her unemployment. And then they make her go down there every single time for her check and sit there for over an hour. And she's got cancer, man, and she's in pain. And she's sitting there for over an hour waiting to see somebody while people are just walking in and sailing out. And it's like, what the fuck is going on here? Why are they doing that to my mother, we went through so much hell, right up until her death. It was like a nightmare. If insult couldn't get worse, it couldn't get worse right up to the death. It was one nightmare that never ended, just never ended. I had to watch that right up until her death. It was like that whole story was a nightmare. She calls an ambulance, they wouldn't come. They said, well, you have a known illness. No, we're not sending an ambulance. And we'd never owned a car, never took a bus. It's like, how do you expect her to get there? She's 2 weeks away from death. And they're saying, no, we're not going to send an ambulance for you. Unbelievable. It's a fight on the phone. She finally has to say, if she dies there in front of her children, it'll be on their head. That's the only way they'd send an ambulance. When the ambulance gets there, they won't send in a stretcher. She has to walk out there, even though she's 2 weeks before death. They won't give her painkillers in the hospital because it's not time yet, even though she's dying and going to die. It was horrible. The whole thing was horrible, right to the bitter fucking end. This whole thing was a nightmare. It was an utter and total nightmare. So I just have to say, when you grow up in a family like this and all this stuff happens, man, nobody should be raised like that, man. So my mother died a day and a month before I turned 19. And on that day, I became a fully independent adult after having lived that life. The life fully immersed in the world of addiction.